All right, Internet. I want to try something new today. So I think what I'm going to do is for the next couple of videos, or however long the series is, it might be intermittent, we might have stuff in between. I want to basically create a series of videos where you and I kind of go through a document together, where I've read it, I've done some additional research around it, and I wanted to kind of pull out some interesting tidbits that I thought were interesting to me as I'm going on this learning journey. And specifically, I wanted to talk you through cloud security. I'm starting to get more involved and more deeper into that concept and understanding more about the acronyms and lingo and understanding what is actually useful and what is kind of just marketing. And I want to kind of give you the reason I did this, the inspiration for this, is actually this guy named Mark. I'm showing you on my screen here on the left-hand side, and he does these videos from time to time where he'll be on and be doing a live stream and also recording for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and he's basically reading a document or working through something live for everybody to watch and like work along with him. And this is a recording, not live, but maybe we'll develop the courage to do it live eventually. But with this video, what I really want to do is basically walk you through this white paper here that I worked through with AWS, and it's a security pillar within the 5 pillars of their well-architected framework. And what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to walk you through this paper. Hopefully it's not an hour and a half like most of his stuff is, maybe 20-30 minutes. And I'm really just going to pull out some of the highlights that I thought were interesting and interesting to me in my context from my perspective. So there might be something interesting in here for you or somebody else. But yeah, so I want to keep it really informal, and I think the concept of this is something along the lines of a reading room, where you have a space to go in and read and informally kind of digest content and work through it together. So that's what we're going to do here. It's going to be very informal. There's going to be a lot of pauses, I'm sure, so feel free to do double speed or fast forward. Very little edits. Don't want to edit this. So with that being said, let's dive into this white paper and talk through really some of the stuff that I thought was interesting and some of the cloud security concepts that either that resonated with me or that were a surprise to me. So let's go through this. So like I said, this is the security pillar of a 5-pillar framework that AWS has created, and they continue to update consistently. And the well-architected framework, like I said, has 5 pillars. So let's go down here a bit further. I think it's down here. Yeah, here it is. So here you can see they have the 5 pillars that are their framework, right? So we have operational excellence, security, reliability, performance, and cost optimization. So the one that I'm focusing on, and I'll probably continue to focus on, is probably security, maybe a little bit of reliability and operational excellence. But with the security one, what we're going to do is we're going to work through the paper, and we're going to see what we can find. So when you go through this, the first, I'd say 15 pages are not really exciting. They talk through a lot of fluff, it felt like, marketing talk. Not really marketing, it's not salesy, but it really didn't seem like there was much substance. But anyways, so let's scroll through this. One thing I will point out here is the shared responsibility model. So the shared responsibility model that, interestingly enough, so there's reInvent that has a lot of really good lectures, and there's also Reinforce that has a lot of good lectures, and they also have online training at AWS. So all this is Amazon oriented due to the white paper, obviously. And these 3 different sources have tons and tons of interesting content, and most of this content, I would say 50 or 60% of it, they always talk about the shared responsibility model, at least for 30 seconds at the very beginning of every talk, just to emphasize the fact to their clients that if you go to the cloud, that doesn't mean necessarily you don't have to do anything, because there's actually a lot that you have to do to secure your data, to secure your network, and to secure everything that's inside of it. And one of the things that they mentioned quite often, let's zoom in a bit here, is, oh wait, got to do that. Let's zoom in here now we can, is the shared responsibility model. And here you can see that when they talk about the shared responsibility model, they say AWS has the security of the cloud, right? So they use of, and then they say the customer, you, has security in the cloud. Now, really what that means is that AWS is going to basically focus on the physical stuff, right, in the meat world. So they're going to focus on the servers, they're going to focus on the physical locations, the data centers, all that stuff. In addition to that, they're also going to focus on some software. So some of that software is mainly going to be a lot of firmware and low-level lying software, usually sitting within some sort of, not a virtual machine, but like the hypervisor that the virtual machines sit on top of, or usually containers now. And then as a customer, you can see that your arrow is a lot bigger than their arrow, even though that I'm sure they do a ridiculous amount of work here just to do this well. But I think they do this to emphasize the point that you have a lot on your plate. And most of that is going to be either access or data. So you can see that a lot of this revolves around what you have access to, what kind of data is being exposed, and all the stuff that's in between that. So that's one important thing to point out here, one important thing that they talk a lot about, so wanted to bring it up. So if we keep going a bit further, abuse and compromise, I thought this was kind of funny where they basically stated that, if any hokey pokey happens on our cloud, we're going to kick you out really fast. And basically they state here that they're always monitoring everything, internal event monitoring. They have external security intelligence. So that's basically they're doing, probably some sort of pen testing against their network and yours. And then they also have complaints. So these are like different ways that they can get information if there's bad things that are occurring. Here's some examples of what shouldn't happen on their cloud. So if we go a bit further, governance, this was okay, nothing really to talk through there. The risk likelihood, so this is basically when you're doing threat modeling, not really relevant, not specific to the cloud. Operating workloads, so we'll go over this, not really anything I wanted to point out here. So we'll go straight into, I'll skip some of this because this is a lot of introductory stuff here. So identity access management, it's like the first actual piece of content that's specific or relevant to securing the cloud from their perspective. And it's actually a huge portion. You can see we're already on page 10 of 45, so 15% or whatever. And this is actually a topic that I'm planning on spending a lot more time in going forward, just due to the fact that when doing research into specifically this paper and the associated lectures and courses and things and adjacent to securing the cloud, specific for Amazon, is that identity and access management, mainly these policies, are what separate secure companies between non-secure companies in the cloud. And these well-architected, detailed policies can actually do a lot for the users as well, because it gives a lot of freedom to developers and things like that within bounded boxes that the security team are happy with and okay with. So if we scroll down here a bit further, the identity management piece is interesting because they actually had a separation between humans and machines. So within the cloud and everywhere else, really, there's a discernment between identities for humans and machines because they're not treated as equals in the sense, but it's important to actually have specific permissions and policies lined up for machines, and then specific permissions and policies lined up for humans. Now, these can manifest in many different ways. Two of which that I came across were roles and users. So we'll say role is R and then users here. So the difference between these is that a role tends to be a machine with temporary credentials. And then a user tends to be a human with permanent credentials that are rotated consistently. Now this isn't always true, because you can have a role that is then given to a human that has temporary credentials for whatever service or task they're doing. The same thing applies for users. They could have a machine that has the permanent credentials that are rotated consistently. So that's not an always, proved thing, but it's something that is interesting and is something that they refer to quite a lot in here. So we'll keep going a bit. Centralized identity. So this is something they hit on pretty hard as well, because when you scale, things get complex, and having a central repository, especially utilizing single sign-on services and also SAML tokens and things like that, as a way to federate the identity and also have kind of like the stranglehold on the identities in a safe and secure manner using their services or somebody else's. So we'll keep going a bit here. So I have some notes to make sure I don't miss anything that I thought was interesting. So talk through this stuff, talk through this, and we're on identity access management. Humans and machines, we already talked about that. All right. So you can see they're talking about temporary credentials, making sure that things are always changing. Audit and rotate credentials that are permanent, making sure that those change. And really I guess let's clarify here, because this is actually something I needed to understand as well, is that there's a permanent credential and then there's a temporary credential. Now, permanent credentials are rotated, right? And these can be rotated, I don't know, let's say every week or something like that. And then we have temporary credentials that are temporary, bounded by either a specific task or a specific time frame. Now, most of the things that I've come across in this paper and other things around it seem to be usually bounded by a task. So the temporary credential is provided for a service to do a function, and then once that function is finished, then that credential is purged, and then they rotate a new credential for the new service, a new action it needs to take. So these are very, very ephemeral. They're always changing. So this could be, let's say, S for a service that you're doing, or it could be time bound based off of, say, for 24 hours, these credentials will be valid and then they'll be purged and replaced. That could be something, such as, something in like web security is like cookies. Like cookies are ephemeral and they change in time based off of, the session that you have existing with that server that you're working with through your client. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So before I move on past this piece, I wanted to point out some really, really good resources for identity and access management. Mainly due to the fact that I found these useful, and I think you will as well if you're interested in this, you're watching this video. So first things first is I would actually watch this. I would probably watch this one first. And really this is a 60-minute, it's kind of self-explanatory. This lady here, Bridget Johnson, I don't know how to say her name correctly, Bridget. She does basically a master talk in 60 minutes talking through what policies are, how they're utilized, and also how to create more complex and advanced ones. So I thought this was an interesting talk. Another one, and adjacent to that, is and I watched these in a series, and I thought they were all useful. And this one is another one that was given not by Bridget, but somebody else, Becky, and she goes through talking about identity access management from a different perspective. Another one here is Bridget again. So this is a recent one from 2021. This one's shorter, and she talks about next gen. And this is really talking, I think this one specifically talked about tagging. There's this concept called tagging, and also, I think it was like tagging, where you can basically tag different policies to a group. And say I'm a developer. I'm a developer in a team that's working on a project. So I'm developer 1 working in project group A, and if I change my team for a new project, then all the policies that I've had and all the permissions I've had are then wiped clean, and I get the new permissions in the project group that I'm in. So everything is group based, and I'll try to talk to that a little bit more later on in this, but that was pretty important. And then another thing I'm probably going to read, which is no easy feat. This is almost 1,000 pages, so I'm not going to read the entire thing. I'm going to read certain parts of it, and I'm going to skim a lot of it. But I want to spend more time in the policy writing and creation of those policies, because it is, I think, one of the most important pieces of actually hardening a network and ensuring everything is gated off correctly. So those are some resources I wanted to share there. So, and also a lot of these resources are linked here, as you can see. So when you get through this white paper, you can actually go to those yourself. All right, so permissions management, identity-based policies. So identity-based policies are most of the policies. There's resource, permission, boundaries, etc. So we'll kind of work through some of this stuff. So first things first, with identity-based policies is it's based on an identity, right? So you're either a machine or you're a human, and you're going to have specific policies allotted to that type of person, user, or role. And with most of these, you're going to utilize the customer managed policies. At least that's kind of what they've stated here, and I can believe it based off of the lectures I've listened to and things I've read. And this is basically policies that are managed by you, the customer. You create them. You might be able to take some templates from Amazon, because I know they have some templates for policies and examples, and you can manipulate them to how you please. So if we go a bit further, resource-based policy. So this is basically limiting the policy to a resource. So it could be an S3 bucket, an EC2 instance, and those limit those machines to certain things. Permission boundaries. So this is basically, there's a thing, service control policies here. So this here and this here are seemingly similar in my head, where basically it's stating that this is the max amount of permissions that you as a user can have within this group. So let's actually take a step back and do one thing here. So when reading through this stuff, I saw that there was a lot of discussion about having a hierarchy of orgs, and in those orgs you'll have organizational units, so OUs, and I have a diagram I'll show you in a second. And inside of the OU, you will have maybe some users and you'll have some roles. So let's say that within this OU, you're going to have permission boundaries, meaning that the max amount of things that you can do will be limited through a threshold. So it'll say this is as much as you can do in here. And then that gives these individuals in this user and role group to say, I have as much freedom as I want within the bounds that have been provided to me, hence boundaries. Same thing applies to the service control policies. So this is basically limiting the permissions to the max amount that you can do something. Attribute state stuff here. So this is actually one of the talks that I referenced. The most recent one, the 30-minute video, talks a lot about tagging. So you can see here they mention tags. So this is basically their variant of attribute-based access controls. So if you're doing a task, you're going to get that tag of that thing. And then once you're done doing that tag is then disassociated from your identity, and you no longer have those permissions to do that thing. I'm probably doing a horrible job at explaining this, but hopefully you read this and watch the videos. Session policies, I read through this and I kind of understood it. Session is basically, you create a session with something, and in that session you have a set amount of permissions. Once that session is then deprecated, those permissions are then taken away because that session has been, exempt or removed. Define permission guardrails. So this is what I was just referring to. So you have your max boundaries. Least privileged access is something they talk to a lot. This is something everybody talks to a lot. And one point I'll point out here is when reading through this, they stated that there's two ways to go about this. When first starting out, be very specific on the permissions that you give to an individual. So there's, two paths, right? So path one is be very specific on what you give out and start small. So we're going to start very, very small. And then over time, we're going to then grow the amount of permissions that we give to that group. And as we grow those permissions, we're only giving the specific permissions that are needed for them to achieve their tasks. Another thing that is kind of in accordance with this, that kind of wraps up with it, is that when you have a lot of permissions that are given either initially or legacy issues, because you want the developers mainly to be very innovative and be able to do what they would like, this breeds into a lot of concerns, because if you give somebody a lot of permissions, that means that they may have an opportunity to cause a lot of chaos. So what they talk about here is that over time, Amazon actually helps you with purging permissions and policies set up that are no longer used. And this is based off of time-based things. So over time, really the goal here is that when monitoring permissions, you want to actually reduce them over time. You want to make them a lot less until it's only to the point where they have exactly what they need. And I think the way that they do this is based off of the last time a permission was utilized or a thing was accessed. So I can jump over to my, let's do this. Jump over to my notes to show you specifically what I'm talking about. Let's go down here. Actually, let's do control find time. I can type. Yeah, here we go. So the point here is they have last access timestamps. So they have Amazon provides these timestamps, and these timestamps are basically showing you that the last time this was accessed by this either service, this machine, or this human was X. And if you keep this, you kind of keep this as a log, and you start seeing that more people or more machines are no longer accessing this specific permission or a specific function, then you can actually take that away. And that's how you kind of reduce that size of those permissions. So it's only limited to what's needed for that function in that group. Another thing I'll do is actually jump back up here and walk through this here, because I wanted to kind of walk you through what this looks like. So let's zoom in. And let's specifically talk to this. So this is the picture I was referring to, where you have your root account, which should never be used, basically, as they say, like, create it and then never touch it. Then you have these organizations. So this could be your organization here in the root. So this is your organization account. And then you have these OUs. But as you can see, they have OUs down here. So let's not say it that way. Let's say that we have a root account. We create it, never touch it, only for break glass situations. And then we have our organizations. So we have different organizations here. And inside of these organizations, we have organizational units. And inside of organizational units, we may have groups of users and roles. So this could be a group of users, and this could be a group of roles. And all of these are going to have boundary permissions. So saying that, we'll set the boundaries here, saying you can do a max of these things. And then here, that'll trickle down to the roles, saying, okay, these roles will have a max of doing these things based off the things here. And another point to actually point out here is that it's not just creating boundaries, but also creating permissions. So this is all from a talk that I'll share with you in a second. So the SCP is basically our boundary. So this is the max, so what we can do. And then these IAM permissions are saying, me as a specific user, these are the specific things that I am allowed to do with the functions that I need to achieve. And the overlap of the max boundaries and the permissions given to me are what they're referring to as kind of like the harmonistic aspect of mixing the two. And a really easy way to say that they summed it up into a sentence, is that the SCPs are the limits and the policies are what you can do. And when you have the meeting point between those two, that's really what allows you to do the work that you need to do as a user within cloud setup. And what I was referring to for the video was this video here. So this individual did a talk in 2019, and it was basically talking about governing multiple accounts and organizations and things like that. So I think this actually does a really good job. This video talks a lot about organizations, organizational units, how they mix together, and the importance of those. So I highly recommend checking that one out. All right, so let's keep going. Least privilege, talked about that. Public cross accounts, nope. Sharing, okay. So this is the point I was talking about earlier. So making the circle smaller based off of the timestamps of last visits. All right, so a bunch of resources, recommend checking them out. All right, on to detection. So detection is really all about logging, tracking changes and tracking malicious behavior. And you can see that's mentioned right here in this first sentence. And for them, that's really how they break it down here. So they say unexpected behavior and then tracking configuration changes. And as I'm sure you know, and everybody else knows, is that the biggest concern with any cloud, anything, is really just the implementation of it and the misconfigurations that are sitting within that either network or permission policy. So let's keep going a bit. So for detection, they talk about configuration. So this is interesting because with tracking logs, a lot of logs that we track tend to be actions that are taken either through a process or a person. But they also have ways to actually track the configuration changes of a CloudFormation template or some sort of like permission policy that's set up. And to kind of give you a high level of what this is first off, a CloudFormation template is just like Terraform, which is infrastructure as a service, and it's basically a large YAML file that is a series of steps and things that you should do to create your network. And it's a way to rapidly, at scale, basically create networks and infrastructure via code automation. Something else that I'm going to dive into, and that's probably really thinking when reading through this report, really the two things I took away from it are I need to learn more about policies and how they're structured and the conditions within those and how to write good ones. And then the other thing is actually a lot around infrastructure as code, which is something that everybody's talking about, but learning more specifically about Terraform, not CloudFormation, which is AWS's version of Terraform, mainly due to the fact that Terraform is something that's open and is ambiguous of a cloud provider, and it's not necessarily going to lock you into a specific cloud provider. So I could use Terraform in Azure, Google Cloud, and also Amazon. So back to tracking and logging. So here they talk about configuration, tracking configuration changes. So here they have a few things mentioned. So CloudTrail is like many logs that you and I know and love, which is basically tracking specific account activity and actions that are taken within those. AWS config is tracking specific changes to configuration templates and setups, like I said with the CloudFormation piece. So if infrastructure as code YAML files change or policies change, things like that, that's going to be detected and logged via here. Guard duties, basically they're malicious activity and anomaly detection. So you can see that basically they're going to find weird anomalies in your network and bad things that are occurring, usually malware, things like that. And then Security Hub is basically their SIM. And that's all funneled into that. So configuration, tracking configuration changes is important. That's kind of some of the interesting pieces that I got from that. Let's keep going through here. So they centralize it all through Security Hub, which is a SIM. We all know what SIMs are. Resources, we'll skip that. Investigate. So I'll leave this for the incident response piece, but there is some interesting videos around creating automated runbooks and playbooks for incident response when actual incidents occur. And I'll go to that when I get to that. I'll skip this. All right, infrastructure protection. So this is another interesting thing that I will want to dig in deeper to, which is kind of correlated and connected to the infrastructure as code, is figuring out the structure of a well-hardened network within security, within the cloud security space. And specifically in here, they talk about some of the things that you'll want to learn and understand specifically are these items here. Now, a region is basically like, a region on the planet. So we can say that like this is like North America, right? NAM. An availability zone is going to be something that sits within that region, and there's going to be multiple of those. So this could be, I think they have like North America East. So we'll just say NAE. So that's North America East. I think it's like Virginia or something. And this availability zone is going to have a series of servers and a whole bunch of data centers and stuff inside of it. A region is basically saying that we have availability zones inside of this region. Local zones are going to be things that are very highly in demand. So this could be pushing servers and different types of high-end compute items and things like that closer to the consumer. And that could be like Netflix, right? So you're trying to get a lot of data from Netflix consistently, and having local zones closer to their customers gives higher bandwidth and higher speeds. And then Outpost is basically on-premise stuff. So if you're a government or a huge organization doesn't want to necessarily share any of your data anywhere, and you want to make sure that your AWS items are where you can see them and touch them, Outpost is basically an AWS provided server rack that you can put inside of your data center and is run by them, but is in your circle of love. So that's something that I want to learn more about, and that's kind of interesting bits that I took from there. If I go a bit further, protecting the network is really talking about how to structure they call it a VPC, which is a virtual private cloud, and that's basically just it's like a network. And in that network, they talk through a series of items here. I'm actually going to pull up my notes for this because there's some images and slides that I wanted to show. So let's scroll to that section, wherever it is. Here we go. So VPC, like I said, is a virtual private cloud. Inside of that virtual private cloud, there's going to be a series of items. So let's go to this image here. And I'm not going to talk through all this because I honestly don't understand everything. But there's a few things that I do understand that were made very pertinent by other talks. And this isn't necessarily the lectures I've listened to, but you kind of get the idea here. So ignore everything, only listen to what I point out. So with the virtual private cloud, the important thing here is redundancy and also separation and having multiple layers to your cake. And I think I may have mentioned that somewhere. Let me make sure I find... I don't know if I have it here. Definitely do. Cake. All right, yeah, creating layers to your cake and controlling where the icing flows. All right, so the point I'm making here is something, a point that they make inside of their document, where it's basically stating that within your network, there needs to be multiple levels to it, and those levels should have increasing levels of restricted access and also security. And this is like any network, right? You have a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, where it's like the buffer between the public and you, and then you have a private section and things like that. And then also, depending on how that traffic flows, you have different types of access control lists and things like that allow items in through firewalls and gateways and things like that. So if I scroll down a bit here, I'm really going to point out a few items. I'm not going to talk through everything. But first thing here is you can see that this is a region, right? So the region here is Sydney. I don't know how good this is to see. The availability zone right next to it is AP Southeast. So that's the availability zone piece I mentioned. We have our gateway, which is allowing people in, our WAF, all this stuff. So we have all of our protection and all of our kind of like this is the outer shell. So we're doing load balancing. We're protecting ourselves from DDoS attacks, XRSF attacks, things like that. And then we have our virtual private cloud. So this is kind of like the overall network that we're protecting from the outer world. Inside of here, we're going to have availability zones. We're going to have redundant versions of it. So if this whole zone here goes down, then we still have these two zones to keep operating. Now, in addition to that, we're going to have different subnets. So we have a public subnet, but we also have protected subnets. And if I scroll down a bit further, you'll see that we even have restricted subnets. So that's the one thing I wanted to point out about the layered cake, right? So we have our public subnet is the top of the cake. We have our middle tier, which is our protected, and then we have our restricted, which is the bottom of the cake. And as the data flows through and the access flows through, it gets more restricted over time. And we have a series of connections to get through that and actually to connect to certain items within here. And that's something they talk quite a bit about within the paper, and also the importance of actually making sure those networks are set up and there's only certain access that can be made there. Because if you can access the public subnet, that doesn't necessarily mean you can access the protected subnet. Only certain services, only certain actions can actually gain access to this based off of the policies you've written in the past, and also the they call it NACLs, which is Network Access Control Lists, of when the data can flow through. Same thing applies for the restricted section. So I'm not going to kill you with that diagram because honestly, I'm killing myself with it already. So here we go. One important thing I wanted to point out that I thought was interesting is they have these stack sets, which is CloudFormation stacks, and these are basically pre-created templates that you can actually throw into their CloudFormation setup in AWS, and it pops out a network like this where you can click into it and it's very interactive and you can learn more about how things are utilized and what they do. A few talks that I wanted to share with you. There's 2 talks here. So this one is best practices for security and setting up a good network. And in this video here, I think he actually shows a few different networks.
Then have to.
I think here maybe. Yeah. So here you can see in his slides, he talks through something very similar, right? So we have our public piece, we have our kind of our shared layer where things can be shared between the internet and you, our applications, which is private, and then we have our extra private section, which is our database. And as we work through all these tiers, there's going to be a series of NACLs and routing tables and things like that of who can access what. So I think that's a super good talk to watch and kind of get an understanding of it. This is a newer version of him talking through very similar concepts, maybe some new services and things like that included. And then the networking talk was interesting as well, where this individual walks you through a lot of stuff that's pretty deep, but still interesting to see. Networking talk about networking at scale through the cloud. So with that, we're gonna push on. So layered cakes, make sure you have them. Controlled icing as it flows through the cake, aka ACLs and permissions. Inspection, protection. I think that's mainly just like WAFs and stuff. Web application firewalls. Acronyms are horrible. And network protection. Okay, we're good there. Protecting compute. So this is really around EC2 instances, which is their version of renting out a computer. And really here they're talking through a lot of the common practices that everyone really does, specific for protecting a computer. So vuln management, making sure it's keeping up to date and it's patched, reducing the attack surface, so removing any libraries, components, things that don't necessarily need to be on that machine, bringing it down to its bare bones and only having what's on there, what's needed for it. And one interesting thing that I found here that I plan on looking into, and I've come across before I read this, was the CIS critical controls. So they actually have hardening images that you can utilize. So let's do AWS CIS hardening images. And here it is. So in here, you can actually download and launch images that are specific for Amazon. And these are already hardened for you. And there's different levels of hardening here. And when you launch it, it's going to open up AWS and you can create that content and put it inside wherever it needs to be put in from the marketplace. But it's nice to know that these hardened images are already created and they're proven to be hardened because they've been checked by all these individuals. So you can kind of repurpose people that have already done the work for you and just set those up correctly. I thought this was interesting. So when I read this, I interpreted it as, what was it? Spooky actions at a distance, which is, quantum physics and stuff. But this idea here is basically removing the people from the equation, or at least distancing them from the actions and data. And that's a common occurrence through a lot of what's discussed in this paper and through a lot of their talks, is basically stating that it's important to remove the human from as many potential errors as possible. And specifically, they talked a lot about the AWS Systems Manager which in my understanding is basically a simple way to automate workflows. Like you can see, automate workflows, documents, etc. So it's basically kind of like, if you're into security, it's kind of like a SOAR tool where it does a series of actions for you, and orchestrate and automate them, things like that, where you have a series of kind of like steps that should be taken based off of an event that's occurred. And that's kind of what they're trying to do here, is basically incorporating as many machines into the processes that we understand. All right, code signing, all that good stuff. We're going to go forward, data protection. So classification, this is something that you'll probably understand and you've read in the past, but identifying data. So really the classification piece is like, know what's important, know what's sensitive, all that good stuff. Once you've notified that, then basically utilize their tagging mechanism. So remember, it's attribute-based stuff. Use your tagging for the data. So once you have, level 1 data, level 2, level 3 data. So level 3, nobody should touch. 2 is some people. 1 is mostly everybody. You can tag these, right? And once you've tagged all these, then they're going to all have permissions associated to them, and also access that can be accessed to them. So adding those tags for permissions. Lifecycle management. So this is another interesting thing, is basically saying, like, if you don't need the data, don't use it. Get rid of as much data as possible. So if shit hits the fan, then you don't have the data in your hands to get in trouble. And then automate. That's something they talk quite a lot about in here. So data, when it's resting, tokenize it. So it's basically, don't have the actual data, have weird hashes for it. Encrypt it if you can. I think one interesting thing I'll point out about this is a lot of individuals talked a lot about their key management service here. And this is just a way to mainly store, rotate, and encrypt, and use keys specifically for different types of encryption services. So KMS service is something they heavily hit on for a lot of their stuff. And that was interesting to see that. I think the secret managers is another thing that we'll probably want to dive into, you and I both, in the future, because it seems like it's a pretty important factor for a lot of everything, really. So we'll go through this. It's all good. Here's another concept basically saying keep people away from it. They talk about system managers again. Data at transit, probably a lot of encryption stuff. Yeah, certificates, encryption, authentication. Yeah, nothing there really. All right, incident response. I think it's the last thing, incident response. So they talk through kind of the goals and what you want to do here. It's nice that they actually have a series of links that link you out to other documents that are useful. So this is obviously the NIST's guidelines for having a good series of steps for responding to incidents. Here they talk about educating, giving those incident responders time to actually improve themselves. Let's see anything that's interesting. All right, so when looking at this, there's a few things that jumped out to me when I was reading through this that I thought was quite interesting, is automating the playbook. So as I mentioned previously, there was an item that I came across that I wanted to share here. And this talks a lot about incident response. And really it talks about run books and the importance of really figuring out what's the manual process. And once you figure out the manual process, then prune the manual process to the point where it only has like everything that's needed for the process. And then take that and break it down into small bite-sized logical steps and sequences that can then be codified. And then take that codified concept, put it inside of an actual playbook that's automated. So when an incident occurs, this playbook automatically runs and does a lot of what's needed for the response to the incidents. And that's for like the very simple incidents. And you can kind of just keep automating and codifying away basically all of these processes until you're only working on things that are very custom or outlier events. And inside of this video, this individual actually talks through an interesting kind of flowchart here that is his process. And I forgot, I think it's like Firefox or something. I don't really know where he works, but I think it's like Firefox or something along those lines, Mozilla maybe. Why is it there? Go away. So in here, you can see that he talks through his process of the actual incident response, and all this stuff is codified, right? So the first step is they notify somebody, they detect something, they protect something, they respond to the overall piece, and this response has a high to low level incident. So if it's a low level incident, it does this type of response. If it's a high level incident, then it does this type of response. They have a recovery phase of different items they do here. They do different types of logging based off of the fidelity of the response. So if it's a low level one, they might just do net flow. If it's a high level one, they might do an entire PCAP and store that into an S3 bucket here. And at the very end, they actually do a notification. So the notification happens twice, at the beginning and the end. And it's actually, for this specific use case, it's automating into a Slack instance, where it's telling them things that are occurring and the steps that are being taken. So I thought that was pretty neat. So the playbook's automation piece is pretty cool. Another thing around access is actually having specific permissions set up for break glass events, where if you have an incident that occurs, you don't necessarily want to have to go through the process of giving your IR respondents the permissions they need to actually do what they need to do. So the break glass permissions is basically God mode, not root access, but a lot of access, to where the IR responders can actually do and get access to all the tools, all the data, everything they need to get access to do what they need to do inside of that instance. And that's kind of what they talk about here, is making sure that access is pre-provisioned, and also the tools are deployed and pre-provisioned as well, because you need to log and do all this stuff prior to the incident so you actually have the information to look at, to do your response. So that was good. All good there. They talk a lot about game days, so making sure you practice. Practice makes perfect, especially when it comes to responding to incidents and chaos is everywhere. Ensuring you have the right communications and all that stuff. And I think that's the conclusion. That's it. So this was the very first version of the reading room. So we informally got to walk through some stuff together. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed some of the resources I was able to share with you, and I hope that this was useful. And Internet, I'll see you another time.